Welcome to this episode of Substantial Matters, Life and Science of Parkinson's. I'm your host, Dan Keller. At the Parkinson's Foundation, we want all people with Parkinson's and their families to get the care and support they need. Better care starts with better research and leads to better lives. In this podcast series, we highlight the fruits of that research, the treatments and techniques that can help you live a better life now, as well as research that can bring a better tomorrow. More than 50 years after its discovery, Levodopa is still the most effective treatment for Parkinson's, and many people can successfully manage their Parkinson's for years using oral dopaminergic medications. But after a while, some people experience frustrating off periods and dyskinesias, like we heard about in our previous episode with Dr. Irene Malati. At the World Parkinson Congress last fall, neurologist Mark Guttman, director of the Center for Movement Disorders in Toronto, Canada, told me about new Levodopa delivery methods, some that are already available and some still being studied, that may make it easier for people with Parkinson's to control their symptoms.
So I think the most important thing to emphasize to patients and their families is that Levodopa is still the best drug that we have to use to treat Parkinson's. There are some issues with it, and there are some strategies to hopefully improve on the delivery. So we know that people continue to have a response. One of the things from the lay literature gives patients, that I see at least, this false concept that Levodopa only works for a certain number of years, 5 years, and then it doesn't work anymore. That's just not valid. The new delivery systems for Levodopa include things that are just becoming available, the Duodopa infusions. This has been going on in Europe for the last 15 years, where patients would actually have an operation. That tube would be put into their small intestine, the duodenum, and there's a continuous infusion of Levodopa within a solubilized gel that they would wear in almost a purse or a satchel with a pump. This can be very effective, however, has risks and benefits. One of the risks is it costs about $70,000 a year, which is huge. You have to have an operation, be hospitalized, and this has been acceptable in Europe, but I think we'll have major problems, at least in my country, to have lots of people be able to get it.
Even in Europe, it's been slow uptake or limited uptake. So what kind of patients would this be most appropriate for?
This is for people with advanced Parkinson's who would not be deep brain stimulation surgery candidates, who have significant response fluctuations. So that means that they go from the medication working to not working at all, or having profound dyskinesias that are hard to treat when the medication is working. So there are some new developments that hopefully will eliminate that need for surgery, for hospitalization. One of the things that's coming along is with a company called Neuroderm, where they've actually put this same kind of strategy of infusing Levodopa slowly, but in a constant mechanism, but doing it in a patch formulation where there's a little needle that infuses it under the skin, and you wear a pump that's much smaller. So no operation, can be just put in a patch, and that's coming along in development. They're looking at the equivalents to Duodopa as we speak, and because it's a generic drug, it doesn't have to go through all the stages of development. So I think they're hoping within the next year or so in Europe, and studies in North America are just starting.
Would something like that still require some carbidopa orally or somehow else?
Carbidopa is included in the formulation. There's another formulation which people talk about that is sort of a gastro-retentive formulation. So these are fancy capsules that have almost an accordion structure embedded into the capsule. You swallow the capsule in the stomach, the capsule dissolves, this accordion thing opens up, and there's levodopa and carbidopa embedded into this accordion preparation that stays in the stomach for a long period of time and slowly releases levodopa. So we don't know how effective that's going to be. We've heard in the lecture today that it's not just the absorption of levodopa from the stomach. We've got other factors, including dietary things that may affect the absorption of levodopa, so the subcutaneous administration may be better. But we've also heard that it depends on the dietary amino acids that people take that may affect the transport from the blood to the brain. So in many respects, there are better delivery systems than we currently have. We know that levodopa in control-release Sinemet, for instance, doesn't work that well. In this country, there's other options, including Rydery, we don't have in Canada, so I don't really know how well that's working for people.
Now, this retentive pill, it's been described as sort of an accordion, which is encapsulated and then kind of unfolds into the stomach. So it sounds more like a just mechanical retention in the stomach. Do you end up with a bunch of these little things stuck in your stomach, or what happens?
Well, it's interesting. When they approached us to do clinical trials, people actually had to have endoscopies, so gastroenterologists or surgeons looking into their stomach at the beginning and the end of the study just to see how these things work and does it cause damage to the stomach. We don't know yet. When I talk to my colleagues that are involved in Duodopa centers, when the gastroenterologists are involved in putting this tube into the stomach, they claim they actually see pills of levodopa that have been around for days at a time that have been totally unabsorbed and are just sitting in the stomach. So it'd be interesting to see what's happening with these accordion things. Hopefully they don't stick around and cause damage, but we don't know that yet.
It sounds like some of these new things would have wide applicability. The Duodopa does not. That's an invasive procedure and it's for later stage patients. But you see some of these, and which ones would be for the general PD population?
I think all of these fancy approaches of modifying levodopa delivery are really for the more moderate to advanced patients. So, most of my patients, I've been doing this for 30 years, in the early stages of Parkinson's, are very well treated by the agents that we have. So levodopa carbidopa, we have in Canada levodopa benzerazide, works very well. And I have patients that are still going strong 20 years later, don't need anything else. So it depends on the individual, but I don't think that these fancy delivery systems, unless they can show if you do continuous infusions that it prevents some of the problems that we're having, there's no evidence for that, at least in my mind at this time. So these are more meant for people who have developed wearing off or dyskinesias.
There's also in development an inhaled levodopa, CVT 301, I think. Inhaled insulin sort of went nowhere. Do you think people are going to pick up on inhaled levodopa?
I'm not so sure. It depends on how they do with it, because you may get this big jolt and just be sent into wild dyskinesias and may not be able to control the motor functioning as well. We know that there were delivery systems that haven't been so effective, like apomorphine injections, for instance, and there was sublingual apomorphine that was being developed, intranasal apomorphine that was going to be developed. They never went anywhere. So I think clinical trials are going to tell us how effective these things are.
It may tell you safety and efficacy, but in the end, I guess it really depends on patient acceptance, and you'll probably only know that if they're not in a clinical trial, real-world kind of situation.
Absolutely. So I think the apomorphine injection for a sudden off time, if a patient's by himself without having the injectable product on their body, it's not going to work because they won't be able to get to it. So if somebody can't use an inhaler properly because they're off, it may not work either. So we learned a lot from when things are actually approved. In my career, we learned a lot about side effects of medications, for instance, all the impulse control disorders with the dopamine agonists that were not apparent during the clinical trial stage at all. So you're totally correct about that.
Anything else in development that's going to potentially give better dopa delivery?
What we heard from Dr. Nutt in the lecture today is that he was suggesting that there may be some type of ester or formulation of levodopa that helps blood-brain barrier transport, or maybe even fusing it with other molecules that don't need the transport mechanism to get across. I hadn't been aware of that, and that would be interesting to see if there's some way of bypassing that amino acid transport mechanism to go from the blood to the brain.
So that would probably depend on something that's lipophilic, something that is fat-soluble rather than water-soluble?
Yeah, exactly. And how do you get rid of that part of the molecule before it gets to the nerve cells? He also mentioned something that I was aware of, but I'm not sure how easy that's going to be, which was using adenoviral vectors to deliver aromatic amino acid decarboxylase to the brain. So give the metabolic machinery in brain cells or glial cells the ability to take the levodopa and make it into dopamine where it's needed. So this would be very invasive, a stereotactic injection. So in other words, making a hole in the skull, putting a probe into the brain, inserting either viruses that deliver the stuff or some other mechanism to have that metabolic enzyme machinery to produce dopamine in the brain. That would be really interesting, but what is the risk of that? We don't really know at this time.
In our conversation, Dr. Guttman mentioned a lot of potential treatments with new and complex modes of action. For more information, visit parkinson.org/podcast and click on the link for this episode or call our helpline at 1-800-4PD-INFO. If you want to leave feedback or comments on this podcast or any other subject, you can do it at parkinson.org/feedback. We'll respond to some questions in future episodes. At the Parkinson's Foundation, our mission is to help every person diagnosed with Parkinson's live the best possible life today. To that end, we'll be bringing you a new episode in this podcast series twice a month. Till then, for more information and resources, visit parkinson.org or call our toll-free helpline at 1-800-4PD-INFO. That's 1-800-473-4636. A resource you may find particularly helpful after today's chat with Dr. Guttman is our free book, Parkinson's Disease Medications, which goes into detail on medications for all aspects of Parkinson's, including motor symptoms and non-motor symptoms such as mood and sleep disorders, gastrointestinal issues, and more. Thank you for listening.